Hi there, for everyone who's joining, we'll start momentarily, but thanks for coming to the annual meeting. For those just joining, we'll wait a minute or two for other people to log on and get started, but thanks for attending. For anyone who's just joined, we'll wait just a minute and then we'll get started. Okay, maybe we should get started, and I'm sure other people will be joining in progress. Hi there, I'm Jeff Mazer, Board President of OJMCHE. Thanks for joining us for the 2021 annual meeting, and thanks for your continued support of OJMCHE. 1 year ago, I didn't think we'd have a second consecutive online annual meeting, but here we are. We have an interesting program planned with remarks from Judy Margles, as well as a presentation by Elaine Coughlin of a new group of OJMCHE directors for approval by the members. It's a very distinguished group, and I thank Elaine and the nominating committee for their work. We also have a guest speaker, Melissa Yaverbaum, Executive Director of the Council of American Jewish Museums, who will be presenting a talk, From Upheaval to Reinvention, Jewish Museums Before and After the Pandemic, about recent thinking on the opportunities and responsibilities of Jewish museums. In the past year, we have seen twin scourges of the pandemic and a dramatic increase in white nationalism and anti-Semitism. For OJMCHE, the unavailability of a physical exhibit space required us to find creative ways to communicate with our members, visitors, and staff. At the same time, our mission to use Jewish history and the lessons of the Holocaust to envision a just and inclusive world became more important than ever. When the world shut down in March, our focus shifted to taking advantage of the tools that were available to us and to create programming that would not be available if we were limited to in-person programs. So what does that mean? We asked ourselves, what do we need to do differently because of the pandemic? And in the past year, we've hosted 60 events and exhibits, both online and, believe it or not, in person. More on that in a moment. Our first online program after the Oregon shutdown was in May, and our first online program about the pandemic was shortly after that. Other cultural institutions pivoted to online programming too, and over the past year, I've seen some great programming from Portland and around the US. But in the spirit of what do we need to do differently, we collaborated with other Jewish museums and other community organizations to present programs we wouldn't have otherwise. And we've heard from speakers we'd never be able to hear in person. Just last week, we co-hosted a program on white supremacy with the Jewish Museum of Maryland and the Baltimore Jewish Council. And as a native Baltimorean, I was happy to see that. And earlier, we collaborated with the Jewish History Museum and Holocaust History Center of Tucson. Our speakers have come from across the US and as far away as Germany. Also in the spirit of what do we need to do differently, we turned the museum inside out and used our windows as our exhibit space. When the Garden Bar Cafe next door closed, we turned their windows into our exhibit space too, for good measure. Ranging from our John Lewis windows last summer to our shelter-in-place photography and video installation, to Amanda Gorman's stirring words from President Biden's inauguration in January, to our Dwell Together in Unity windows designed by prospective board member Benjamin Arif, our windows have been a way for us to continue to educate and entertain our members in the Portland community. As always, the Oregon Holocaust Memorial remained the focal point of our work. In May, we were gratified to see over 30 people come to the memorial for a morning of cleanup and maintenance. That was the photo you saw as you joined the meeting. This is a testament to the determination of our members and supporters as we experience firsthand the hatred so prevalent in our society with the attack on our memorial earlier in May as it was vandalized with Nazi imagery. During all of this, our educational programming and our archival and collections work continued uninterrupted. Judy will talk more about that later. Our education team switched to remote learning, visiting classrooms by Zoom and creating a rich library of teacher resources. Much of our educational materials are online for those interested in learning more. We were also one of 10 museums nationwide selected for Chronicling These Times, an oral history project to record and collect our community's stories of this pivotal time in our society's history. Of course, no cultural institution can exist without funding, and we're extremely grateful to our members and other donors for supporting OJMCHE over the past year. We're projecting a positive budget balance with revenue of $1.2 million and expenditures of $938,000. Our financial position was strengthened by federal dollars from the Payroll Protection Program and state CARES money. Because of these funds, we were able to keep all museum employees on the payroll through the past year, with the exception of our cafe and reception staff. We also received generous operating grants from a number of foundations, which allowed us to continue and create our online and in-person programs and exhibits. Finally, we recently completed a survey and appreciate the 244 responses we received. Surveys are valuable tools for understanding our role in the community, and thanks to everyone who took the time to participate. While we are still compiling the results, in broad strokes, while the majority of respondents are looking forward to returning in person to the museum, comments about health and safety appropriately tell us that we're still in the midst of a pandemic, must take all precautions to stay safe. Numerous comments also commended our online programs. As the pandemic hopefully winds down, please stay safe as we look to a return to more normal life, and we look forward to welcoming everyone into the museum auditorium for our annual meeting next year. In closing my remarks, I'd like to introduce the following video created for the museum's 2021 virtual gala, which I hope many of you attended to celebrate OJMCHE's work during these complex times. We repurposed it here in a slightly edited version because it so aptly conveys the essence of the museum's vital work. Thank you. Amber?
The Oregon Jewish Museum does two things very well. It connects visitors to the importance of resisting injustice and supporting their peers, but it also demonstrates the power of education and the inspiration of creativity. When State Senator Rob Wagner began his initiative to mandate statewide Holocaust education, he turned to the Oregon Jewish Museum to work with him. I had the privilege of being at the museum when Governor Kate Brown signed into passage the Holocaust and Genocide Education Mandate.
This bill would not have happened if it wasn't for the diligence, experience, expertise, and passion of Judy and Amanda.
For all visitors, there are lessons in how to recognize the roots of hate and how to participate in a vibrant, inclusive democracy built on understanding and embracing differences. There could not be a more meaningful time than now to engage audiences with the museum's work.
The Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education has been such a lift during this period. It's been such a level of political violence in the city of Portland and nationally. But it is the museum that helped hold this community together, providing important spaces for us to come together and to discuss solutions that move us forward together.
Since COVID-19 forced the museum's physical closure, museum educators zoomed into action, talking with educators about how we could help. Remote learning lesson plans, professional development opportunities for teachers, and Zoom classroom visits are now the underpinnings of the museum's offerings.
And I was also lucky enough to have Amanda join us as a guest speaker to teach our students about resistance and rescue in the Holocaust, to which my students responded quite strongly. I'm also tremendously grateful for the virtual Holocaust Memorial Tour that OJMCHE launched this year, which has allowed my students to connect with your work.
My first time in the museum was a really eye-opening experience because I learned a lot of history and realities that had been missing or idealized in my classes. I'm currently on the student advisory board, and it's been really wonderful to be able to meet new people and connect with others during this time. Despite COVID, we plan to connect with students across the state in a variety of ways, all virtually, and I'm really proud to be a part of it.
Nor has the pandemic stopped the museum from excelling both in exhibitions and public programs. Last May, in the midst of the Black Lives Matter protests, it began activating its street-facing ground floor windows. Now any of us can walk by and see panels from the core exhibitions: Oregon Jewish Stories, Discrimination and Resistance, an Oregon Primer, and great art. The museum is also participating in the Council of American Jewish Museums Oral History Project, chronicling these times, capturing the way we have collectively and individually experienced COVID-19, the struggles for justice, the 2020 presidential election, and the aftermath. 35 volunteer interviewers have interviewed 230 individuals from 9 counties.
So I called my sister at the end of August. It was her birthday. And this was the only time that I really acknowledged what was going on. Really. I called her, I said, "Happy birthday." And she said, "Yeah." She lives in Austin. And she said, "Yeah." And she started laughing. And then I started laughing. And then she started laughing. And then I started laughing. And then I started crying. And then she started crying. I mean, we were like hysterical. And it was just kind of like, yeah, happy birthday. You know, it was like, it was just some moment that we both acknowledged, like, this is really terrible.
Oral histories are an invaluable source of community history. There's so much that you can learn about a person and their life from a 2-hour conversation. OJMCHE has a little over 800 interviews that comprise our core oral history project. The interviews span 6 decades and capture the stories of people from all walks of life in Oregon's Jewish community. It is our job to preserve and share the experiences of our community, and collecting history in this format is priceless.
The museum's virtual, vibrant online programs keep all of us enlightened and informed with an amazing array of films, talks, and discussions.
I am so honored to be a part of this year's educational programs that offered classes virtually to students from this museum. These classes talked about using narratives and storytelling as a means of bringing about changes for greater good. They are all important topics during the time when we are thinking about equity, social justice, and immigrants of color. I want to thank the museum for being a valuable partner in our journey. Thank you very much.
I want to tell you something about my history. More than 20 years ago, I discovered all kinds of memorabilia and papers in the basement of my synagogue in unmarked boxes. It was shocking, but also a thrill, because I realized this memorabilia should be saved and preserved for others. And I realized it's the Oregon Jewish Museum that is this kind of a place for that purpose. Today, as a volunteer in the archives at the museum, one thing I've realized is that all the things of history in the past are repeating itself today. We have economic distress, joblessness, inequality, and hate. And I'm glad to see that the museum is branching out to shed light on these issues as an educational resource for everybody.
I know we all want to see the museum continue to be a place for safe and open dialogue around some of today's most challenging issues. The work that we do together matters now more than ever, as we bring forward lessons from the Holocaust and the forces of prejudice to build a pluralistic community of shared values, inclusion, and respect.
In the world we live in today, we are a strong voice for teaching tolerance through our exhibits, films, programs, and tours for school children. I cannot emphasize enough that we are a museum that teaches. We want every visitor to depart with a better understanding of our history and our common humanity.
You are here because you agree with me that the pillars of shared values, inclusion, and respect are the indispensable pillars of an open, democratic society. The Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education is Portland's home for those ideals, and home is where we start building a better community.
Thank you. I'm Elaine Coughlin, Chair of the Nominating Committee, and it is my pleasure to give you our report today. I'd like to begin, first of all, by extending our heartfelt gratitude to our outgoing board members for their significant work to further the aims of the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. They are Andrea Meyer, Howard Tempkin, and Linda Veltman. Sadly, we say goodbye, but we thank you for your service. I'd also like to present the following board members who decided to accept a second term and will be returning as board members. They are Peter Glade, Ken Helpand, David Newman, Steve Reinisch, Charles Rabinowitz, and Ruth Roth. This year, we have an incredible slate of nominees, but we were also very fortunate to have Liz Lipoff join our board during the pandemic when another board member had to step down. She has not yet been voted on by the general membership, so I am including her in our slate of nominees. I'm going to present to you their names and a little bit about them, certainly not enough, but it'll give you a little background on who they are. First of all, Liz Lipoff. Liz is a former English teacher and journalism teacher, and she has served on many boards, including River Bend, Cascade AIDS, Project Now, and the Oregon Jewish Community Foundation. She has also served as chair of Cedar Sinai Park, chair of Project Access Now, and chair of the Cascade AIDS Project. She works in marketing and serves as a freelance communication consultant. Our next nominee is Benjamin Arif. And Benjamin is a filmmaker who works for Creative Studio. In fact, he created the Gala Studio, the Gala video, and some of you saw a dog video earlier this year. He comes with experience in young leadership programs from Jewish Federation called Pathways, and he has also worked on the Giving Council of the Oregon Jewish Community Foundation. He has served on several boards and has created several Holocaust events while in Arizona. He is a new father and has a wife that is a therapist. Our next nominee is Ilana Stamfer Emlin. And as Ilana stated, you can tell by my name that I am Rabbi Joshua and Goldie Stamfer's kid, number 5. Ilana attended Brandeis University and then worked in DC and moved back to Portland in 1987. Currently, she serves on the board of the Jewish Family and Child Service and Camp Solomon Schechter. She works at Multnomah Education Service District, focusing on school wellness. She has 3 wonderful daughters, and she's very interested in the work of the museum, and she has had the pleasure, probably through her father, of watching the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education grow. Our next nominee is Walker Clark. Walker is an attorney with Samuels, Ziolen, and Cantor, and he specializes in estate planning, trust, estate administration, taxation, and business planning. Walker currently is on the Oregon Jewish Community Foundation and the Giving Council of the Oregon Jewish Community Foundation. He most recently worked with the Eastside Jewish Commons, and he is the father of 2 young children. Our next nominee is Barbara O'Hare, and Barbara runs a business called Dialogues Unlimited, which facilitates conversations on race. Prior to creating Dialogues Unlimited and centering her work on issues of race, Barbara was an executive with United Airlines, working in public affairs. Barbara is very well connected in multiple communities of Portland. In fact, Barbara came to the museum for a talk with the staff and docents prior to our most recent opening of the Southern Rights exhibit. She presently serves on the board of Ecumenical Ministries in Portland, and Barbara is an opera singer and has sung with the Portland Opera Company. Our next nominee is David Gruber, and David is the Director of Academic Support at Reed College. He is very connected to the younger folks and the student community. Because of his position, he is very much interested in institutional approaches to diversity, including racial and ethnic diversity, but also neurological diversity, learning approaches, and abilities. I now present to you our slate of nominees: Liz Lipoff, Benjamin Arif, Ilana Stamfer-Emlin, Walker Clark, Barbara Hare, and David Gruber. Amber, please post the voting poll. I am very pleased to tell you that the members have indeed accepted our slate of officers unanimously, and I'm thrilled that we have 6 new members on the board of the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. It is now my great pleasure to introduce to you our Executive Director, Judy Margles. Judy has demonstrated her talent and passion for the museum. Even during the pandemic, nothing would stop her. We are the successful museum we are today because of her tenacity, her devotion, and leadership. It's my pleasure to introduce Judy.
Elaine, thank you so much. I really appreciate your kind comments. Hello, everyone. So lovely to be with you today, although I think a year ago, we didn't really realize we'd be doing this by Zoom yet one more year, but here we are. Thank you so much for being here. It is, in fact, an exciting time for the museum. After a long year, we're going to be reopening this week. I'm going to get back to our reopening shortly, but first I'd like to begin my remarks with some brief, but nonetheless heartfelt words of appreciation for the board, the staff, volunteers, and of course, all of you, the community that supports our work. I can't imagine how we could have gotten through these challenging times without the absolute support of our board of directors. I'm especially grateful to Jeff Mazur, whose wisdom, sound counsel, astute leadership I appreciate and rely upon. Our treasurer, Ruth Roth, to use her sweet phrase, my friend in numbers, has kept her eagle eye on our budget, which, as you have heard, is something to be proud of in a year of such uncertainty. Every board member deserves a special mention and merits my profound appreciation. To our board members who have stepped down, Andrea Meyer, Howard Temkin, and Linda Veltman, what an honor it was to work with you. And I really couldn't be more excited by our incoming board members, Benjamin Arif, Walker Clark, David Gruber, Barbara O'Hare, and Ilana Stamfer-Emlin. I really do look forward to working with you. Our volunteers and docents have been so patiently supportive with us during closure. Profuse thanks to those of you who are able to continue your work from home. We are really excited to welcome you back this summer. On a different note, this was a year of heartache for many of us. At the museum, and I know for some of you listening in virtually today, the death of Sharon Tarlow last month was heartbreaking. Sharon had volunteered in the museum archives each Tuesday morning for the past 15 years. We miss her every day. I'm a bit of a broken record when it comes to thanking the museum staff, but this year in particular, I'm going to take the time and give every single staff member a little shout out. Gail Mandel, my sidekick and deputy director, curator of collections, Anne Levant Prawl, archivist Alicia Babstein, communications manager Becca Biggs, administrator Heather Brunner, director of education Amanda Coven, project educator Katie Durnell, digital learning specialist Andrew Duden, digital coordinator Amber Curson, and we want to give a thanks for Amber because she's handling all the tech today, museum shop manager Gina Hartman, and Guest Services Manager Beth Shreve. Everyone who works at this museum not only sustained us during the pandemic, but made certain that we thrived. And I'm just thank you from the bottom of my heart. You've heard from Jeff about our fundraising success. I also want to share some other exciting statistics. Since September, our educators have offered 73 virtual classroom visits, 48 requests from teachers for our digital exhibitions, 37 professional development trainings. That means we reached a total of more than 10,000 students and teachers. I think that is something to really be proud of in this pandemic year. Jeff mentioned the COVID Oral History Project, Chronicling These Times, which has been launched by the Council of American Jewish Museums. You're going to hear from Melissa in a very few minutes. And of course, you saw a snippet of one of the interviews in the video that was shown earlier. The video, which we created for our gala, said that we had 230 interviews at that time. We're now well over 275 interviews. There's still time to record your story if you are interested. And finally, as Jeff mentioned, what could have been a year of laying off staff and trimming our numbers instead turned into a year of financial success, thanks to successful grants, our affiliation with the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland and the Oregon Jewish Community Foundation, and most important, all of you who have shown your support with such generosity. So what's next for the museum? Tomorrow at noon, we open our physical doors for a special members free preview, and we hope all of you will be able to join us. This will be followed by our public opening on Wednesday. And then summer programs full of outdoor activities, including in-person walking tours of South Portland and tours of the Oregon Holocaust Memorial. It's felt terrific to get our exhibition schedule back in track, and we have glorious plans for the fall and spring. In the fall, we'll be opening an exhibition about refugees who found safe haven in Oregon. And in February, we're opening an exhibition of Rembrandt etchings. Our education team is now training a new cohort of docents. And when I say now, they're literally out in the exhibition galleries as I speak. We really cannot wait to welcome back real live students, real live teachers, real live visitors. I've made it clear that the museum anticipates our future with optimism, but I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the trauma of this past year. With COVID, the country has endured hundreds of thousands of lives lost, millions ill, the isolation and loneliness that many of us endured, certainly uncertainty, fear, and so much more. Alongside these very physical and emotional anxieties came the moral pandemic, exacerbated by a spate of racial violence and igniting a protest movement in our beloved city that incensed some and made others enormously proud. The situation with houselessness is extreme. You might see tents on our sidewalk when you visit the museum. And anti-Semitism is, more than ever, a clear and present danger. At the museum, we wrestle with the complexities of how we negotiate differences, how we tell different stories, how we seek to embed racial equity into all our projects through inclusive storytelling that illuminates the experience of Oregon Jews and the realities of race and racism, both during the Holocaust and in our world today. It's so easy to despair or complain about this seemingly endless past year and the literal and figurative devastation we have all experienced. What I want us to consider, however, is the power of radical empathy, that we must be willing to consider another person's point of view, even when we strongly disagree, in order to connect more deeply with them. This is the path I want us to travel in our work going forward, and I believe that our mission compels us to do so. A recent article by Paul Mendes-Flohr is worth retelling. The Jewish philosopher Martin Buber said that when reaching out to the other, we must listen empathetically to his or her story and include it within our own. Dialogue, he wrote, is not self-negation, but rather an expansion of one's self-understanding by embracing the voice of the other, who by force of circumstance is one's neighbor. If we are to heed the biblical injunction to love one's neighbor, we do not want to merely live next to someone. This could suggest disinterest in their story or perhaps the complacent concern that their story would threaten our own story. To love one's neighbor is to live not next to, but with them, to create bonds of mutual trust that demonstrate respect for each other's story. It's been a long year, and the work before us beckons with hope and promise. I look forward to working with all of you. Now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce my dear friend and colleague, Melissa Martens Yaverbaum, the Executive Director of the Council of American Jewish Museums. Previously, Melissa served as the Director of Collections and Exhibitions at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust, Curator of the Jewish Museum of Maryland, and Curator of the Jane Addams Hull House Museum. Melissa has also worked with the collections of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the Newberry Library, and the Field Museum. She continues to curate interpretive exhibits for Jewish museums and works for the advancement of Jewish museums and the field. On a personal note, you are in for a treat. Melissa is one of the most thoughtful and intelligent voices speaking on behalf of Jewish museums today. Welcome, Melissa.
Thank you so much, Judy. Thank you to Elaine and Jeff. It's such a pleasure to be here. I have been to Oregon Jewish Museum myself and have known the work of the museum and its community for many years. Off the Record is one of my favorite Jewish museums in the US, so I'm so glad to be here. I think you're going to see in my presentation where the very natural overlapping Venn diagram lies between all the work of my organization, Council of American Jewish Museums, and your museum and your community. I'm going to take a moment now to pop up my share screen, and we'll get started. So thank you again, everyone. I'm going to take a moment just to tell you about my organization for those of you that don't know it already. We are the Council of American Jewish Museums, and we work to strengthen Jewish museums as essential and vital centers of culture, knowledge, and discourse. And our hope is that communities will be made more vibrant and inclusive by their Jewish museums. So we're typically based in New York City at the Center for Jewish History in Manhattan, along with many other partners. And our strength is really in our network, our national network, and our increasing international network of Jewish museums, that we're a small organization, but by bringing together the strengths and the questions and dilemmas of Jewish museums, we're able to advance a conversation that can't always happen in other spaces. So some of the work we're going to do today is to place the work of Oregon Jewish Museum in the context of the community of Jewish museums. And you could see some of them in their variety here. They're all different shapes and sizes. They're all over the US, from Dallas to Skokie, to Florida, to Baltimore, to Los Angeles. In over 60 communities in America, there is a Jewish museum, which is a remarkable number. And I think one thing I always like to explore out loud is, if we have over 60 member museums, and we know there are additional ones, even just in the US, is what is the role of each Jewish museum? So by the time we get to the end of my conversation today, I hope you're all thinking very much about what is the special role that Oregon Jewish Museum plays in its community and also in the world at large. So of course, I know the museum well. I've been to the newest building for the museum, but had also been to the one just prior. I know there is one, and I was at the one before that. So I've been to 3 versions of Oregon Jewish museums. I could say very authentically that it has had some of the steadiest growth of any of the regional Jewish museums in the US, slow and steady gradual growth, even in different times of economic national strengths and weaknesses and different social forces. And I'm so glad to see that's continuing. And some of the projects that my organization is known for over this past year are ones in which Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education was a key partner. One of those was Dwelling in a Time of Plagues, and the museum participated in the Sukkot iteration with a piece by Adam McKinney that was visible from the windows and in the gallery. They were a key partner and an ongoing partner in our work combating anti-Semitism. This year's workshop for us took place online, but the one prior to that took place in in Oregon at Oregon Jewish Museum, we have featured speakers such as Deborah Lipstadt and Eric Ward, who we heard from in the opening video, who of course is such a fan of the museum. And here we see Sankar. This is when we held our program at Oregon Jewish Museum in November of 2019, so a few months before the pandemic began. And here are some of the audience that attended. This year, you also heard that we're running a project called Collecting These Times. This was made possible by a new technology platform called Their Story, which operates a lot like Zoom, but is an oral history collections platform that also does an immediate transcription and has preservation technology. It records the stories. We're using it to record the stories of the Jewish experience of the pandemic. And as Judy mentioned, it is not too late to have your story recorded. We're very interested in making sure that we populate this collective archive nationally with voices that aren't typically represented in the Jewish historical narrative. So we'd love to hear from you. Alicia Babstein has been an absolute national leader in this work, setting an example for museums around the country and around the globe. We now have 18 partners, including a new Museum of the Jewish People in Israel and 17 partners in the US. We also did our online global conference this year on the theme of upheaval, which is also one of the themes of our discussion here today, and looking at the museums around the world and working with an international program committee, including Judy Margles, who's shown here in one of our planning meetings. She was also a featured speaker on the topic of inclusion in the Jewish museum space. So one of the things I want to talk about, and this is really where I'm going to be thinking out loud with you all, is the changing realities. What we know has happened before, and I'm going to show you what some of that looked like just before the pandemic. We'll talk about the pandemic period itself and talk about some examples of work, and then ask ourselves, is the past really an indicator of the future, and see where we go from that. I can say that in the years leading up to the pandemic, for Holocaust museums, one of the most likely tools was the Shoah Foundation's three-dimensional project in New Dimensions in Testimony. This looked different in every museum in which it appeared, but I would say this was definitely a trend leading up to the pandemic. Some of this technology was responsive technology, much like Siri or Alexa, where you could ask the recording of a Holocaust survivor a question about their biography, and if they picked up on the keywords, they would be able to feed a response. So this was something that we were seeing in a lot of regional Holocaust museums. I can also say that in the summer before the pandemic, in New York City, where I'm based, it was one of the most successful seasons I've seen in a dozen years in New York for Jewish museums. And I give the credit in two directions. One of those projects was the Leonard Cohen exhibition that was at Jewish Museum, New York. I'll say a lot of the energy of this project relied on the collective, saturated gathering experience. So this publicity image actually does not do the show justice. We see some people sitting around on beanbags. I think in some scenarios for museums, they ask the people to make it look populated. I could say in this scenario, it was 10 times more crowded than it appears here. And I went on multiple occasions. I could say that other things that were spectacular about the show was that it used not only biography, but contemporary art pieces in which the contemporary art itself was not so removed from the subject. It really was in sync with the historical subject matter. This was kind of a giant communal karaoke booth in which people could be part of a humming choir to the song Hallelujah by Leonard Cohen, and it was really a beautiful piece. But I bring up these two slides to say that even though this was just in the summer before the pandemic, that we can't really imagine those two things happening right now. I think most of us, even if we're going to enter a museum space, even if we're going to take off our mask, that sitting in a crowded room or singing karaoke in a room with other people is just probably not a viable installation for museums right now. And the show will be opening at the Contemporary Jewish Museum in San Francisco. But as you can imagine, that museum has had to really reimagine the whole exhibition. I'll also say that one of the other very crowded installations that same season was the Not Long Ago, Not Far Away show about Auschwitz that was at Museum of Jewish Heritage in Lower Manhattan. Again, a tremendously crowded show, a very expensive show designed by the design firm Musealia. It came from Europe, it traveled to the US, and it was a season in which the Jewish museum spaces were very crowded, very popular. And also you could have two totally different experiences. Downtown, you'd be learning from artifacts of history, dealing with very difficult subject matter, and uptown looking at popular culture. In the midst of the pandemic, there were several museum projects that opened almost miraculously, although they have not yet welcomed their audiences, or at least not at full capacity. One was the Jewish Museum Berlin, which as of a few weeks ago was still waiting to open its doors. And their core exhibition has been entirely redesigned. I'm not going to go into it here, but to give you just a sense of what it looks like based on what people have seen online. I'll also say notably that one of the standout features of the new exhibition in Berlin is one about Noah, which is a purposeful new version of Noah's Ark, which is at Skirball Cultural Center in Los Angeles. So this is a very interesting example where it's not, they're not trying to kid anyone. It is a very direct translation of the California exhibition that is in Berlin. But again, it's interesting. This is going to be a very interactive exhibit that relies on touch, on families. We know the exhibit in California gets very, very crowded. We know that they welcome many visitors, not just Jewish families, but many other families as well. So we'll see how this one does when they open up. Jewish Museum in Frankfurt was also the big exhibition reopening this year. It's interesting, both are in Germany. As of a few weeks ago, this one was not open for a large crowd yet, and it is the oldest Jewish museum in Germany, very different texture, but also very highly regarded internationally. I'll say that one thing that has happened a lot is outdoor exhibitions. So just as your museum hosted Adam McKinney's piece, that was part of a larger national project called Dwelling in a Time of Plagues. And this was an example of the installation at Los Angeles Holocaust Museum. This was an example of the one that was in Tucson, Arizona, and it deals directly with immigration. And of course, outdoor museum space was used before the pandemic, but is really being relied upon throughout and now after the pandemic, of not assuming that all of our activities will always take place indoors. Just as the opening comments to this meeting said, it's not as if we're all just going inside anymore. And I think that that's important, not only for safety reasons, but symbolically, is to recognize that our museums are not just containers in which the action happens inside. We are very important parts of our communities and our landscapes. And if people don't feel that they can engage with us on the outside, how are we going to expect them to walk inside? Of course, museums are reopening everywhere, some with masks, some without masks. And so there's a lot of unknowns and big questions ahead. I think I'm very inclined to think that some of the museum experience will return to quote normal, but I think we're going to explore in this talk how we can't necessarily assume that's going to be the case for several reasons that were already mentioned. Okay, one of the things that everybody knows is that revenue streams in almost any industry were dramatically rearranged. For Jewish museums, one of the things I heard is that museums that relied very heavily on gate revenue, in-person events, and gift shop, so galas, gift shop, and gate, the 3 Gs, took the biggest hit in the beginning months of the pandemic. I think I heard, though, many, many success stories, especially from the regional Jewish museums, that their online fundraisers often exceeded their fundraising goals. So they were able to surpass their goals online, even further than their in-person events. I'm not sure that trend will hold up for the future, but it's a very interesting one that I would not have guessed. For museums that rely very heavily on gate, museums such as the 9/11 Memorial Museum, which is not a Jewish museum, but has many colleagues that have worked in our field, they don't expect normal visitation activity to return until year 2024 based on tourism projections and consumer projections. I think in terms of revenue streams, we also have been talking to colleagues that have noted in other industries that online education and programming, when it's designed to be special online, can be a big income generator. It's hard to imagine today because we all have a little bit of Zoom fatigue and people are enjoying being outside again. I'm one of those people as well, but I think there is untapped potential there. I think that one of the biggest keys for Jewish museums is in new philanthropic partnerships and relationships and configurations, where instead of just going to the same old funders for the same old activities, as we take on new agendas and new activities, we're going to find some really new, exciting natural partners. And I think I've seen this happen in many scenarios, not only for emergency relief, but for museums trying new things and demonstrating that they have built the relationships. So we'll think about that a little bit in a bit. I'm going to give you a magic number that about a year ago, there were some very dire, actually in October, there were some very dire projections for losses in the museum industry. The American Alliance of Museums, in which Judy was a board member for several years, did a field study. And at that point in October, the projection was that 30% of American museums would close. At this point, they just completed another field study. The results came out a couple weeks ago. Some of you may have heard the story on NPR. The current projection is 15%, and what that equals is about 5,000 museums in America. I have a lot of ongoing debates with my colleagues. Does this same metric apply to Jewish museums? I think yes and no, to tell you the truth. I think on the one hand, Jewish museums occupy a very different space in terms of the American narrative and what the expectations are. But at the same time, given a few early predictors, it is possible that we could see up to this level of closure in the Jewish museum field. I'm optimistic that we won't. And I've also heard of many museums that have been flourishing in this time because they're strengthening what they believe in. And I think that that formulation is more applicable to Oregon Jewish Museum. Also from the AAM survey, we learned that on average, museums were shuttered for 28 weeks because of the pandemic and spent $300,000 in closing and reopening. In all, the average pandemic financial loss per museum was close to $700,000 in terms of extra expense and loss of income and revenue. So that's just a metric. Again, I don't think it applies universally to Jewish museums, but it's an interesting set of numbers to look at. I'll tell you something extremely interesting. I showed you a slide a minute ago that was of the Auschwitz exhibit not long ago, not far away, that came to Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York. It is opening, it just opened a week or so ago in Kansas City at the Union Station train hall. And the amount of ticket sales already has indicated it will outpace attendance in Kansas as compared to a Jewish museum in New York. In fact, it says online, due to overwhelming online sales, no walk-up tickets are available. Advanced online reservations are required. Weekday tickets are currently sold out, and remaining dates in July have limited availability. So this is very interesting. I could go on for half an hour just about this, but I'm gonna have to leave you to ponder it, that the popularity of this show in Kansas will outpace New York City. And I'm thinking about that in terms of people's eagerness to go back to museums. I'm thinking about it in terms of Jewish content and what Jewish museums are already good at telling the story of the Holocaust with expertise and fluency. And I'm thinking about it, what does it mean for it to be in that space, in that region, in a non-Jewish space? And what lessons does that tell us? So a lot to think about there. In terms of social responsibility, we all know our country's facing the palpable racial, economic, and political divisions we've all lived through. For the Jewish community, I think there are very special and difficult considerations about inclusion and equity. And Judy Margles and her staff are some of your advocates in navigating that. And addressing these issues can happen. This is where I want to inspire you all a little bit, no matter what your work is or whatever you do in your community, that addressing this can happen thematically. It could happen internally in our organizations, symbolically and practically. It could happen through our tone, through our programming, our mission evolution, and one-to-one delivery. And I'll tell you what I mean by one-to-one delivery in a moment. I live in Brooklyn, and during about this exact week last year, a year ago, when the Black Lives Matter protests were happening, the Trans Lives Matter Day was happening. This is at the Brooklyn Museum on Eastern Parkway, which is serves an audience that is, I don't have the exact statistics, but at one point it was described to me as 1/3 white, 1/3 Black, and 1/3 Jewish, including ultra-Orthodox communities. So it's really interesting that without any particular organizing on behalf of the museum, that this became a symbolic rallying point, and the museum was seen as an ally in terms of the Black Lives Matter protest and trans Black lives. There have been a lot of headlines recently about Jewish museums, and this gets very difficult. We could talk about this for a long time. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back. If anyone who's reading the press has seen that museums are under fire in a lot of ways. Here we see, these are just examples. If you Googled museums under fire or museums criticized, you would see dozens and dozens and dozens of headlines from 2020 and 2021, including who are the sponsors? Do we believe in the sponsors and the funders? Where do they stand in the fight for racial justice and issues such as Black Lives Matter? Who are they accepting funding from? And if you accept funding and stimulus funds, you might be required to repatriate materials. And this one at the end, of course, will give us so many reasons to pause and think that there were protests very recently at MoMA in New York based on the board's connections to Israel. So one thing I've been very conscious of is that most of this critique has not yet landed on Jewish museums. And I think that's partly because we're doing something that people value, but I also think we're not at all exempt from this. And I think it's a sign that the writing is literally in the headlines in the paper, that everything we do from top to bottom has to be very thoughtful and in keeping with what we believe in and with society. We do know that back in October, an open letter was out by Jewish Museum, and their letter from the staff asked for greater diversity and transparency in the museum's operations, which the museum has now taken on with its strategic planning group. We know that Jewish museums, the Holocaust Museum in Orlando and in Maitland, Florida, both took on an exhibit about race, and that there was critique. What is the role of a Jewish museum in addressing race? And it's hard to say that we are the natural experts, but how do we not bring something to the table, which I believe we do? How will we gain the required fluency and expertise? Who will be our partners in that? And what position should we be in to be leaders in that conversation? We know that museums such as the National Museum of African American History are prized museums in society. When it opened in 2016, which feels like a long time ago now, it had so many visitors. For those of you who tried to go, it was impossible to get tickets. And in the opening days, a huge percentage of the audience that went and had arranged for advance tickets had never gone to a museum before in their life, meaning they weren't already museum consumers, but they felt so compelled to go to their culturally specific museums that they were willing to travel from all over, to buy tickets months in advance, to wait in line outside in the heat. So I think it's a really mindful example of the power of a culturally specific museum when it means something to society. We also know that the Memorial for Peace and Justice is part of the national conversation, that it opened a few years ago, but yet it is considered, people are just waiting with bated breath to hear from Brian and to hear what makes that museum so powerful. When I think about some of the vocabulary of Jewish museums and Jewish material culture, we heard today about houselessness in Portland, Oregon. We certainly have deal with that everywhere. And when I think about a Sukkot structure, a sukkah, what potential does that have for us to bring people under the roof and feed people? How might it provide temporary shelter? We see community refrigerators that are decorated by artists in many, many American cities now. What would it mean for that to be a natural tzedakah box or tzedakah station, a gift from Jewish museums and artists to their community? And your museum, Oregon Jewish Museum, is already working with a lot of this vocabulary. We know that digital possibilities have changed everything. We know that in general, museums, including Jewish museums, were not prepared to meet the moment to the level they would have liked with the proper infrastructure. So now we're all re-examining that. What is the digital strategy? What would the infrastructure be to fulfill it? What will be digitally unique and compelling? So it's not taking the place of in-person experience, but it's doing something different and something that was meant to be online. How will we be able to better serve different audiences, audiences that are far away, aging audiences, disadvantaged audiences? And my question really for Jewish museums is, what does creative digital leadership look like? Museums can't be good at everything that big business is good at, but museums are good at things that nobody else is good at. So what would it mean for us to creatively own our own digital space and make it unlike any other digital space? We don't have to be YouTube, we can be something else. We know that the public relies on us for trusted expertise, and the public is looking for reliable data and information. There's a real need for it out there. There's a big distrust of media, but there's also a simultaneous distrust now of legacy institutions, as we saw from those headlines. So what is our requisite expertise and fluency for the next narratives we must tell? How will we use objects to have forward our amazing opportunities? And how can we make narrative our strongest suit? It's already what Jewish museums are known for, is the navigation of narrative. How will we own that moving forward? I like to think of everyone who is in a museum family as a storyteller for the museum. It doesn't matter if they are the person working in the gift shop. It doesn't matter if that's the executive director, the board members, the docents, the people working behind the scenes. Every single person who's part of the museum family represents that museum and tells its story and explains its value to them personally and to others. So when you think about it, every job description is really the description storyteller, even though there are many other functions that we all perform. When we think about the objects, the standard vocabulary in Jewish museums, how will we make these animate? How will we bring people into contact, even if it's at small scale and intimate scale, to really engage with what we are best at? When I think about the possibilities, signing off, I'll say that I always like to think of Jewish museums with a reimagined purpose for the 21st century, to think about different streams for talent, leadership, and staff structure. We don't have to have classical departments. We could have a department for whatever need we want to fulfill. What is suggestive about this for new revenue models? How will we be leaders in our own digital frontiers? How will we constantly repurpose our indoor and outdoor spaces for maximum effect? How can we have one-to-one delivery of our expertise, our content, and even direct social services, whether it's hunger relief or houselessness relief? What is the best museum experience we can provide? How can we be the best Jewish institutions we can be? And how will we re-examine our role in navigating anti-Semitism and racial justice, which are the critical conversations, I believe, that apply to our museums this year? So as I think about the network of Jewish museums and think about the place of Oregon Jewish Museum, if you see all these dots, Oregon Jewish Museum might feel like it's a small dot, but it's actually one of the biggest dots in terms of its importance in the national landscape. And so with that, I would just like to thank you from the Council of American Jewish Museums. Thank you for being part of our professional network. Thank you for bringing leadership and vision. And thank you for being part of the ongoing conversation.
Oh, Melissa, and the thanks really go to you. You were just brilliant in kind of assessing the sobering parts of our journey and the optimism. You also gave us a lot of optimism. I have to say, I cannot wait to be in a situation where we're not dwelling in a time, where we dwell in a time where there is no plague. And I think we all look forward to that. Thank you so much for joining us today. Jeff, I'll hand it back to you to close the meeting.
Great, thanks, Judy. Melissa, I'll add my thanks to Judy. We appreciate your presentation, your continued partnership with OJMCHE. I mean, the breadth of programming presented by other Jewish museums is fascinating, and the opportunities and challenges are vast. Thanks also to Judy and Elaine for your remarks in the presentation of our new directors. And thanks, Amber, for keeping all of this moving. And thanks everyone who attended for attending and for your continued support of OJMCHE. We look forward to seeing you in the museum in the next year and meeting again, hopefully in person, 2022. Thanks, everyone.